The morning she saw him again, she was elbow deep in someone else's crisis and completely unprepared for her own. Waverly Quinn had been on her feet for 11 hours. The ER at Mercy General didn't care about that. It never did, and neither did the 63-year-old man on the gurney in front of her, whose blood pressure was doing something genuinely alarming. She called the numbers to her intern without looking up. She didn't need to look. After 8 years of this, her hands knew what to do even when her brain was still catching up. Dr. Quinn, her charge nurse Bonnie, appeared at her elbow. There's a situation at the front desk. There's always a situation at the front desk. This one came in 3 black SUVs. Waverly pressed 2 fingers to her patient's wrist. Steady now, good. She passed him off to the intern with a list of instructions she rattled from memory, snapped her gloves off, and turned. She almost walked straight into the man being wheeled through the double doors. She stopped. He was unconscious, which was the only reason she was still standing there instead of walking in the other direction as fast as her legs would carry her. Even flat on his back, even pale and clearly in pain, even with a gauze pad pressed to his side that was soaking through faster than it should. Even then, Colton Reyes looked exactly like the kind of man who made rooms go quiet when he walked into them. She had spent 6 years trying to forget what that felt like. The men surrounding him, 4 of them, big, wearing expressions that said they weren't accustomed to being in places where they weren't in control, stepped aside when she approached, not because she asked them to, because she walked like she owned every inch of floor she crossed. And hospitals have their own kind of authority that even men like Colton's men understood instinctively. She checked his pulse. She looked at the wound. She did not let herself look at his face for more than a second. What happened? She asked the man closest to her. Dark suit, jaw like a fist. Knife, he said. How long ago? 40 minutes. Was it clean? A pause. Define clean. She didn't answer that. She started moving, calling out orders, and the team around her responded the way they always did, instantly, efficiently, without question. That was the thing about emergencies. They had a way of making everything else irrelevant. All the things you'd been carrying around for 6 years, all the things you'd never said, all the questions you'd stopped letting yourself ask. None of it mattered when someone was bleeding. She told herself that was why she didn't hand him off to someone else. She almost believed it. The surgery took 2 hours and 14 minutes. Waverly scrubbed out in silence, while the rest of her team talked around her, the ordinary winding down conversation of people who'd done something difficult and come out the other side. She let it wash over her. She was thinking about the number 6. 6 years since she'd last seen Colton Reyes in person. 6 years since the night she'd left his apartment with a duffel bag and a secret she hadn't fully understood yet. 6 years since she'd sat in a bathroom at her sister's house in Portland, staring at 2 pink lines and making a decision that had reorganized her entire life. Her daughter was named Amara. She was 5 years old. She had her mother's stubbornness and her father's eyes, and Waverly had spent 5 years being grateful that almost nobody who looked at Amara would know who those eyes belonged to. Almost nobody. She dried her hands. She walked to the recovery room. He was awake. She had been hoping he wouldn't be. She had been hoping for another hour, at least, enough time to arrange her face into something professional and neutral, enough time to remind herself of all the reasons she'd made the choices she'd made. Instead, she got the moment she'd been quietly dreading for 6 years. Colton Reyes opening his eyes in a room she was standing in, and those eyes finding her immediately, like they'd never once forgotten where to look. His voice came out rough. Waverly. Not doctor. Not excuse me. Just her name, the way he'd always said it, like it meant something specific. You're in recovery, she said. The surgery went well. You lost a significant amount of blood, but the damage was contained. You'll need to stay for observation. Waverly. She stopped. He was looking at her the way she remembered, like she was the only fixed point in a room that was spinning. She had loved that once. She had been 28 years old and completely certain that a man like Colton Reyes looking at her like that meant something permanent. I need to check your vitals, she said. I know. He didn't look away. Give me a second. She gave him the second. She regretted it immediately. because a second was long enough for something to move across his face that she recognized, something that looked too much like relief, and she couldn't afford to respond to that. She couldn't afford any of this. "Your men are outside," she said. "I'll send one of my nurses in. You're in good hands." She was at the door when he said her name again. This time she didn't stop. Amara was at her sister's place, 3 miles away, which was where she always was on Waverly's overnight shifts. Waverly called during her break and listened to her daughter's voice describe, in exhaustive detail, the injustice of being made to eat broccoli when she didn't want any broccoli, and felt the knot in her chest loosen slightly. "Tell Aunt Dara," I said, "the broccoli is non-negotiable," Waverly said. "You always say that, because it's always true, Mom." Amara's voice went conspiratorial. "Can I have ice cream if I eat the broccoli? That's between you and Aunt Dara. Aunt Dara said it's between me and you." Waverly laughed despite herself. "Fine, yes. But all of it, deal." A pause, the particular pause of a 5-year-old processing the terms of a negotiation. "Mom, are you okay?" Waverly pressed her fingers to her eyes. Kids were like that sometimes. They just knew. She didn't know how. "I'm fine, baby. Just tired. Go eat your broccoli." "Okay. Love you. Love you more." She ended the call and sat with her back against the break room wall for exactly 90 seconds. Then she got up because there was no other option and went back to work. He was moved to a private room by morning. Not a regular private room. His men had apparently negotiated something on a floor that Waverly didn't usually work on, a floor where the rooms were quieter and the staff wore carefully neutral expressions and didn't ask questions. She heard about it from Bonnie, who had that particular look she got when she wanted to ask something and was exercising great restraint in not asking it. "The patient in 814 is asking for you," Bonnie said. "He has an attending physician. He's asking for you specifically." Waverly was charting. She didn't look up. "Tell him I'll pass along his feedback." Bonnie was quiet for a beat, then Waverly. "His men are out there tipping the vending machine attendant in $100 bills. I think this might be someone you actually want to handle yourself." Waverly set down her pen. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about all the ways this morning could go, all the conversations she might walk into, all the things Colton Reyes might say that she would then have to respond to, and she chose the version where she remained in control of the narrative. "Fine," she said. "I'll go." He was sitting up when she got there, which meant he was already feeling better than he had any right to feel. The bruising around the bandage was visible above the edge of his hospital gown, and he looked pale, and she could tell from the way he held himself that moving still cost him something. But his eyes were clear, and he was watching the door, and when she walked in, they settled on her with that same focused attention that she'd spent 6 years trying to reframe as something ordinary, something she would eventually stop noticing. She hadn't stopped noticing. "You didn't have to come," he said. "I'm your doctor. You handed me off to Patterson last night. I read the chart. Dr. Patterson is excellent. I'm sure he is." Colton was quiet for a moment. "I asked for you. I know. Did you consider not coming?" Yes. Something moved through his expression. Acknowledgement, maybe, or pain that wasn't entirely physical. "Fair enough," he said. She checked his chart. She checked his bandage. She asked the clinical questions that needed asking and wrote down the clinical answers. And she did all of it with the practiced composure that 8 years of emergency medicine had given her. She was good at this. She was good at holding herself steady while everything else moved. Then he said, "How have you been? All these years?" She put the chart down. "That's not a conversation we're having here. Then where?" "Colton, I mean it." His voice was quiet. Not demanding. She'd forgotten that about him, actually, the way he could be quiet and still fill up a room. "I've been looking for you." The words landed somewhere in the center of her chest. She kept her face still. "That's not. You don't need to have been doing that." "I know I don't need to. I've been doing it anyway." He looked at her with something exhausted behind his eyes, something that had been there for a long time. "You disappeared, Waverly. You were gone. And I couldn't find you. And eventually I stopped trying because I thought you were trying to tell me something. But I never stopped wondering." She thought about Amara. She thought about broccoli and ice cream and a 5-year-old voice that had her mother's inflection and her father's cadence, a voice that said, "Love you," like it was the simplest and most obvious truth in the world. "You should rest," she said. "You had significant blood loss. Your body needs. Are you happy?" She stopped. He wasn't asking to hurt her. She knew that. He was asking because he was Colton Reyes, and he'd always asked the questions other people circled around, had always said the direct thing when everyone else was being careful. It was one of the things she'd noticed about him early on, before she'd understood what he was, what he did, what kind of world he actually lived in. "Yes," she said, and it was true. That was the thing she hadn't expected. It was completely, entirely true. She had built something real, a career, a home, a daughter who negotiated broccoli terms with the confidence of a tiny, unstoppable CEO. She was happy. She was just also standing in a hospital room with the man who had turned her whole life sideways, and the happiness felt more complicated than it usually did. "Good," he said, like he meant it. She left before either of them could say anything else. She should have known the situation would not stay contained. The man in the dark suit, she'd learned his name was Pryor, which suited him, found her in the hallway at 7:30 that evening and told her, very politely, that there had been a development. The word development from a man who looked like Pryor meant something different than it meant from anyone else. "What kind of development?" she said. It wasn't a question. "The kind where we need to move him. Tonight, he is not medically cleared to be moved." Pryor looked at her. She looked back. "Miss Quinn? Dr. Quinn? Dr. Quinn." He corrected himself without any visible irritation, which told her he was either very well trained or very scared. With respect, the people who put him in this room in the first place know where he is. "We've already stayed too long." Waverly thought about the protocol. She thought about what she would say to Patterson, to the attending on record, to the administrators who'd have questions. She thought about all the ways this was not her problem, and never had been. Then she thought about Amara's eyes. She thought about the fact that Amara had his eyes, and that she had never told him, and that if something happened to Colton Reyes tonight in a hospital bed, she had medically cleared him too early to leave. "How long does he need?" Pryor asked. "Another 48 hours, minimum. The risk of infection is significant. If he develops a fever, Dr. Quinn." Pryor's voice was careful. "We don't have 48 hours. She pressed her fingers to her forehead. She thought about choices. She had made exactly one enormous choice 6 years ago, a choice she had made alone, in a bathroom in Portland, and that she had built her entire life around, and she had never, not once, regretted the outcome of that choice. But standing here in this hallway, with this man in this impossible situation, she could feel the edges of that choice pressing back against her, and she understood, with a clarity she hadn't been expecting, that the choice wasn't finished. It had never been finished. It had just been waiting. If he leaves, she said, he needs specific medications, specific wound care, and someone who knows what to watch for. He can't go to another hospital. They'll ask questions. He needs, she stopped herself. Pryor waited. He needs consistent medical supervision. She said it evenly, professionally, like it wasn't the most reckless thing she'd agreed to in years. "I need to make a phone call." Her sister's voice was groggy. "Wav, it's almost 8. I need Amara to stay with you tonight. Maybe tomorrow too." A pause. Dara was good at pauses. She'd been reading Waverly for 34 years, and she heard something in this one. "Everything okay?" "Yes." And then, because she was talking to Dara, "I don't know. Maybe. Is this about work?" "Yes." "Is it about work? Or is it about work?" Waverly looked at Pryor, who was studying the wall with professional detachment. "The second one," she said. "Possibly. Waverly." Dara's voice went careful the way it always did when she was worried and trying not to show it. "You don't have to fix everything. I know. But you're going to anyway. She needs broccoli at dinner. All of it. Wav, tell her I said goodnight." The safe house was in a part of the city that Waverly had driven through occasionally but never stopped in. One of those neighborhoods that looked ordinary on the surface and asked no questions. The building was nondescript. The apartment inside was not. It was large and carefully arranged and looked like someone had anticipated staying in it, which meant someone had been planning for this contingency for a while. Waverly didn't ask about that. She focused on what she knew. She set up the medication schedule. She went through the wound care routine with an efficiency that she could feel prior watching with something close to respect. She checked Colton's temperature, still normal, which was good, and updated the parameters that would tell her if things were going wrong. Colton watched her work with an expression she couldn't fully read. He was better at that than she was, always had been. The careful face, the stillness. But he'd had a long night and significant blood loss, and she could see in the spaces between his careful expressions that he was tired in a way that went deeper than the wound. "You didn't have to do this," he said when Pryor had stepped out. "I'm aware." "So why did you?" She was organizing her kit. She kept her eyes on what her hands were doing. "Because you needed a doctor and I'm a doctor. You have a hospital full of doctors. Colton, I'm just asking." She put the kit down. She turned around. She looked at him for a long moment, this man she had once loved, this man who had disappeared from the world she understood and revealed himself to exist in a world she hadn't known, a world she had chosen to step away from before she'd even fully understood its shape. This man whose eyes her daughter had inherited without ever having met him. She was going to tell him. She hadn't known that exactly until this moment, but she could feel it the way you feel a decision that's been made somewhere underneath all your thinking, the kind that surfaces when you're finally still enough to hear it. "I have something to tell you," she said. He didn't speak. He waited. That was always what he did. He made space, he waited, and the space had always made her feel like she could say the true thing, whatever it was. She sat down in the chair beside the bed. "Her name is Amara," she said. "She's 5. She is the best thing I have ever done, and I need you to understand that before I say anything else, because the decision I made for her, and I would make it again." She looked at him steadily. "But you deserve to know. You've always deserved to know, and I have been holding that for a long time, and I think I told myself I was protecting her, and I genuinely was, but I was also Waverly." His voice was very quiet. She stopped. "She's mine," he said. "Not a question. Yes." The room was very still. She watched him, and she thought about all the ways she had imagined this conversation, the ways she had rehearsed it in the dark, alone, all the versions in which he was angry or cold or didn't believe her. She had not imagined this version, which was the version where Colton Reyes sat very still in a safe house hospital bed and looked like something that had been braced against impact for a very long time had finally been allowed to stop holding. "Tell me about her," he said. So she did. She told him about the negotiating and the broccoli and the way Amara laughed at her own jokes before she got to the punchline because she couldn't hold the funny thing inside. She told him about the way Amara slept with a stuffed elephant named Gerald and had opinions, very strong opinions, about which brand of orange juice was acceptable and which was not. She told him about the drawing Amara had made of their apartment that she'd brought home from kindergarten, where Waverly was depicted with enormous red hair. She did not have enormous red hair, and a stethoscope the approximate size of a subway train. She talked until her voice went rough at the edges, and then she stopped, and she realized she was crying, which she hadn't been expecting. Just quietly, she hadn't been expecting it, and she didn't try to stop it. Colton reached out, slowly, because moving still cost him. He put his hand over hers. "I'm sorry," he said. "For whatever I did or didn't do, that made you feel like you couldn't come to me. I'm sorry." She shook her head. It was complicated. What you were, I know what I was." He said it evenly, without apology but also without pride. "I know what it looked like, what it was. I'm not asking you to have made a different choice." His hand was warm. She had forgotten, somehow, how warm his hands were. "I'm just sorry you carried it alone." She wiped her face with her free hand. She would have had questions. She still will. "I know. Can I meet her?" It was such a simple question. She had spent 5 years being afraid of it, constructing the possibility of it into something enormous and impossible, and here it was, just 6 words, asked quietly by a man who was holding her hand in a safe house because she had made a choice she couldn't finish making without him. "Yes," she said. "I think, yes. 3 days later, she drove to Dara's to pick up Amara, and her daughter ran at her with the full-body velocity that 5-year-olds deployed as a matter of standard practice. Waverly caught her and held on, breathing in the smell of her hair, feeling the weight of her, real and solid and entirely herself. "I ate all the broccoli," Amara announced into her shoulder. "I heard Aunt Dara said I could have ice cream 2 nights in a row." "That seems like an escalation of the terms." "I negotiated." Waverly laughed and set her down and looked at her, this specific particular person who had the whole world in front of her and no idea about most of it yet. The eyes that looked back at Waverly were bright and curious and entirely unbothered by anything, the way only a 5-year-old who had been well and thoroughly loved could look. "I need to tell you something," Waverly said. She crouched down so they were level. "When you're ready, whenever you're ready, there's someone I want you to meet." Amara studied her with the particular focus that she deployed when she was deciding whether something was important. "Is it a friend? Something like that? A new friend or an old friend?" Waverly thought about that. "Old," she said finally. "A very old friend. Someone I knew before you were born." Amara processed this. "Do they like orange juice?" Honestly, I don't know. That's important information, Mom. I'll ask," Waverly said seriously. "I'll make sure we know going in." Amara nodded, satisfied, and turned to say goodbye to Dara with the decisive energy of someone whose questions had been answered to an adequate degree. Waverly stood up and met her sister's eyes over her daughter's head. Dara raised her eyebrows. "Well?" Waverly took a breath. There were 100 things still unresolved, questions about what his world meant for their safety, about what this would look like, about the 100 conversations that would have to happen before any of this made sense. She knew that. She was not pretending it was simple, but she also knew this. She had stopped running. She had said the true thing. She had sat in a room with Colton Reyes and told him his daughter's name, and he had asked to know her, and Waverly had said yes. And now the secret she had been carrying alone for 5 years was no longer only hers, and the strange thing, the thing she hadn't expected, was how much lighter everything felt. Not easy. Just lighter. She took Amara's hand and walked to the car. Behind her, the house was warm and lit in the early evening, and the street was quiet, and somewhere across the city a man was reading the name Amara on a piece of paper Waverly had written out for him. Her birthday, her school, her teacher's name, everything, and holding it like he was afraid it would disappear. Waverly buckled Amara in and got behind the wheel and pulled out onto the street. "Mom?" Amara's voice came from the back seat. "I think if the new old friend doesn't like orange juice, we can still give them a chance." Waverly looked at her daughter in the rearview mirror, those eyes looking back at her, completely certain. "Yeah," she said, "I think so too."